And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we continue to talk about the full aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And when I say full, that means that we are including both the short-run aggregate supply and the long-run aggregate supply. The long-run aggregate supply being a more Keynesian, being a more classical concept. Short-run aggregate supply being a more of a Keynesian concept. So I'm calling this the full model. Everything's on here. And I did an example in the previous video where we had a stock market decline by 89%, and the government decided that it was not going to respond. So the question was, how does the economy often in the end work that out? And we went through that process on that previous video. So that was very much of a classical point of view. Government's not going to respond. Government's going to stay out of the way and just let this work itself out. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at this more from a Keynesian point of view. So we're going to redo the same problem, only now the role of government is going to be that the is going to be that the government is going to respond. Government is going to do something when we get knocked out of equilibrium, when we fall into a recession. Now, to do this, we want to start talking about the Keynesian response. We just want to define a word here very quickly, and that is the term fiscal policy. Fiscal policy. So let me define fiscal policy just very roughly. Fiscal policy is when the government uses government spending or taxation in order to shift the aggregate demand curve. They're going to use government spending or taxation in order to shift the aggregate demand curve. Now, I'll come back to that idea here in a little bit. Let's start here. Stock market falls 89%. If the stock market falls 89%, my determinant, we've done this a bunch of times, my determinant in the aggregate demand determinants would be a change in consumption wealth. People's wealth is going to go down, and therefore they're going to consume less. And that's going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift into the left. That's going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift into the left. So my story is going to be decrease wealth causes a decrease in consumption. And by the way, what do I mean here when I say story? Just to clear this up in case there's some confusion. The story is just retelling a determinant or retelling a moving along the curve. We're just retelling the stories of shifting a curve, or we're retelling the story of moving along the curve. All right? I'll try to be a little bit more clear with that. So this aggregate demand story, this is just the determinant. This is just this determinant. Obviously, when the stock market goes down, wealth is going to fall. And when wealth is going to fall, people then are going to consume less. And if they consume less, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift into the left. That's it. That's our story, and let's record that here. Aggregate demand curve shifts into the left. Now, as the aggregate demand curve shifts into the left, that means that prices are going to begin to fall. We're going to get a decrease in the price level. Prices are going to fall. Why? Because people are buying less stuff. If people are consuming less stuff, then the demand for goods and services is going to fall, and that means their prices are going to begin to decline. Now, that leads me to an aggregate supply story. So that means that we're going to move along the short-run aggregate supply curve. We're going to move along the short-run aggregate supply curve. So when we do, when prices begin to go down, now we got to do that story of sticky wages. What does sticky wages say? Sticky wages says, okay, real wages are equal to nominal wages divided by the price level, and we said that we said that in the short run, wages are sticky, so the nominal wages aren't going to change. So as prices decline, because people are buying less stuff, that means that real wages are going to have to rise. Now, if real wages go up, what's going to happen? If you get an increase in real wages, I'm going to squeeze this in here, increase real wages means that companies will decrease the number of people that they hire, And if they decrease the number of people that they hire, that means that the gross domestic product is going to go down. So that happens right here. The gross domestic product is going to go down. All right? The gross domestic product is going to go down. And by the way, I didn't say this on previous video, and I should have. This is called right here, from Y2 to Y1, that is called a recessionary gap. That is called the recessionary gap. That is called a recessionary gap. Why? Because you're in a recession. Okay? This Y1, by the way, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's this long-run aggregate supply curve doing here? Well, the long-run aggregate supply, that is telling you what is our long-run potential. This is our potential GDP. Our long-run ability to produce goods and services is at Y1, and we are producing below that. We are now producing here at Y2. We are producing below our long-run potential, and that is called a recession, a recessionary gap. So the economy is in a recession. Okay, what does it look like over here? So what happened is prices are going down. The gross domestic product is falling. We're in a recession, and unemployment as a result is rising. So that's the first thing that happens. Now, from a classical view of the world, you would do nothing. And I'm going to move back to the classical example here. So here's the classical example that we did. It's exactly the same thing so far. All this is exactly the same. And the classical economist says, well, we're just going to sit and wait, and eventually wages will adjust, and we'll get back to long-run equilibrium. That was a classical view of the world. But the Keynesian says we can't sit around and wait. People are unemployed. People are getting laid off. Maybe they can't pay their mortgages. They're losing their homes. Their children are having to drop out of college because their incomes are going down. Whatever. All these bad things are happening. So the Keynesians will say we can't just sit around and wait for wages to adjust. Instead, we need government policy. We need fiscal policy. And specifically, this real-world event, I'm going to say, is what we're going to call expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy. And that just means that we want the economy to expand, so we're going to use fiscal policy in order to try to expand the economy and shift the aggregate demand curve back to where it was before. So what does that look like? Well, specifically, the government would change government spending and change taxes. So it would be a change in government spending. Specifically, they're going to increase government spending, and it's going to be a change in consumption taxes, and specifically, they're going to cut taxes. These are both expansionary fiscal policy. So let's write that out as a story. What the story would be now on the aggregate demand curve is going to shift again, and the aggregate demand is going to shift because you're going to get an increase in government spending. That's going to increase spending, obviously, and you're going to get a decrease in taxes, which is going to cause an increase in consumption, and that's obviously going to increase spending. And so then that's going to cause the aggregate demand curve to shift back to where it was before. The aggregate demand curve is going to shift right back to where it was before. And so aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. As the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, we're going to move back along the shortened aggregate supply curve going the other way. Prices are going to start to get bid back up. As prices start to get bid back up, then, all right, we got to come back down to this sticky wages again. And we got to say, all right, the real wage is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level, and we said the nominal wage is sticky, it's fixed in the short run, and so as a result of that, prices are now going to start going back up because of the increase in government spending and increase in consumption. Aggregate demand is shifting to the right. Prices are getting bid back up. As the prices get bid up, real wages are now going to come down. And as real wages come down, that means decreased real wages means companies will increase hiring. They will hire more people, and as they hire more people, that's going to increase the gross domestic product. So here's the increase in prices back to where we were before. Here's the increase in GDP back to where we were before. The recessionary gap is closed. The recessionary gap is closed. And so at the end, what happens? At the end, prices, here's how I'm going to say this, prices return to where they started. They went down, and then they went back up to where they were. Gross domestic product's going to return to where it started. GDP went down into recession, then it went back up. And unemployment is going to return to where it started. So the way that we can think about this is what's really happening here is the government is responding to the decrease in consumption by increasing government spending and increasing consumption through cutting taxes. That's what they're doing, and shifting that aggregate demand curve back to the right. And then we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for the economy to solve itself. We have a policy in place, and we can get that aggregate demand shifting to the right away and get this recession over much more quickly. What's the downside to this? Well, of course, the downside to this is if we're increasing government spending and cutting taxes, then the government's going to accumulate debt. Do we worry about it? Yes, but we do it anyway, and we'll talk about paying that debt off later on. We can talk about paying that debt off in the future, but right now, we just want to make sure that we bring the recession to an end. So that's very much of a Keynesian view of the world. So let me just kind of review these, the classical and Keynesian side by side. If I go back to the classical view of the world, we get knocked out of equilibrium by the aggregate demand curve shifting. That knocks us out of equilibrium. And then it's the short-run aggregate supply curve that brings us back to long-run equilibrium. The short-run aggregate supply curve brings us back to long-run equilibrium. And then in the Keynesian view of the world, aggregate demand knocked us out of equilibrium. Aggregate demand knocked us out of equilibrium. Aggregate demand gets us back to equilibrium. Aggregate demand gets us back to equilibrium. So maybe that's why we would call the classical economists supply-siders, because they worry about or allow the supply curve to get us back to long-run equilibrium. And the Keynesians are more demand-siders. They look for the demand side to get us back to equilibrium. All right, that's a lot of stuff there to keep track of. I will do some more examples of these on future videos, and this stuff just takes a lot of practice and a lot of thinking. This has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.